Did you know that all sorts of things go on in an all girls boarding school? A school where only female students are admitted, and they sometimes have male teachers. Nene was one of the girls that found herself in such a school. Nene was a beautiful and calm teenage girl. She was always in her room and barely had any friends. She had always been a quiet and introspective child, someone who preferred the company of her own books and her own thoughts over the hustle and bustle of the world around her. Her parents, David and Amaka, were incredibly successful business owners who had built all their fortune from scratch, and Nene was their only child. While they always provided every material thing that Nene wanted, they were rarely ever present in her life. They always gave Nene money. She had a lot of clothes, shoes, bags. She went on trips constantly with her parents. She had a seemingly nice life, but she was always feeling lonely because she never got to enjoy the true company of her parents. Nene had grown used to being raised by nannies who would come and go, each one leaving a faint but fleeting impression on her young mind. The absence of a real connection with her parents shaped her into someone who found solace in her own privacy. One holiday period, the school session had just finished and Nene was once again on holidays. Nene was always at home as usual, with nannies and cleaners coming around to do their duties. However, when time came for school to resume again, the nanny resigned. The nanny went to Nene's parents, David and Amaka, and told them that she had to go back to the village to tend to her sick mother. So David and Amaka were stuck again, thinking of what to do. As usual, they contacted all the people that they knew to help them get a new nanny. But time was soon running out, and they weren't able to get one because they had to take a trip. So impulsively, they made a rather irrational decision that they were going to send Nene off to a boarding school. They didn't put much thought into the decision because it made perfect sense to them. In fact, they thought to themselves, why haven't we thought about this sooner? We would have saved ourselves so much stress all this time. They summoned Nene one evening and told her, Kanene, you are going to be going to a boarding school from now on. Nene was surprised and a bit scared. She had never ever been to a boarding school before, and she is somebody that really likes her privacy. So she wondered what it would feel like to be in the midst of so many other students all the time, to sleep and wake up next to them. The school that David and Amaka chose was St. Margaret's College. It was one of the most prestigious all girls boarding schools in Nigeria, known for its excellent academic record and strict discipline. She'll be in good hands, her mother said, reassuring herself more than anyone else. Her father agreed, though neither seemed to consider the emotional toll it might take on their daughter. Nene was obviously not happy with the decision, but she didn't say anything. She just kept it to herself. It's not like her parents ever bothered about how she felt about any decision that they ever made. They always did what they wanted anyway. On the outside, she showed little emotion, but inside, she felt a deep sense of abandonment. St. Margaret's College had a beautiful compound, lined with towering trees and immaculate gardens. The buildings were old but well maintained, and the students who walked its corridors carried a sense of pride and privilege with them. Nene, with her suitcase in hand, felt small and out of place. She was quiet, shy, and unsure of what this new chapter of her life will be like. On her first day of school, she met Bissy, a bubbly and outgoing girl with a bright smile. Bissy was everything Nene was not: confident, loud, and unafraid to speak her mind. They were assigned to the same dormitory, and despite their contrasting personalities, a bond quickly formed between them. Bessie took it upon herself to guide Nene through the intricacies of boarding school life, how to navigate the strict rules, when to speak and when to remain silent, and most importantly, how to avoid getting on the bad side of Priska, the most popular girl in school. Priska was the queen bee of their class. She was tall, beautiful, and very intelligent. She had been at St. Margaret's since her first year of secondary school. She was used to being the center of attention, both from her classmates and her teachers, particularly Mr. Edward, the English teacher. Priska had always been the best student in English, and she prided herself on it. Her beauty, wit, and intelligence made her the natural leader amongst girls, and she had two loyal friends, Ada and Shadi, who always followed her everywhere like little sidekicks with no brains. Nene's arrival, however, began to change things. Though Nene didn't like attention, she never wanted to be the center of attention at all, and she didn't go seeking for it either, but it came naturally to her. She was exceptionally beautiful, with delicate features and a quiet grace that drew the eye of people around her. And when she spoke in class, it became clear that she wasn't just beautiful, she was also very brilliant, particularly in English because she spent a lot of time reading books. Nene always answered questions in class, and it was beginning to shift the attention from Priska. Bessie was very proud and impressed by her friend, and she was the first person to realize and notice Priska's discomfort towards Nene because of how Nene always answered questions in class. So, Bisi decided to encourage Nene even more to answer more questions because Bisi never personally liked Priska. She always felt like Priska was always doing too much. She was a bully, she was rude, and she was also very arrogant. So she was happy to see somebody make Priska feel somewhat uncomfortable. Priska's annoyance and irritation towards Nene became more and more obvious as Nene gathered more and more attention. Priska also noticed the way Mr. Edward's eyes lingered on Nene when she raised her hand to answer a question. She noticed how he smiled a little more when he spoke to her and how Nene's work began to receive more praises than her. It infuriated her. Priska had always had a soft spot for Edward. She always admired him, always wanted to help him carry his bags. She sized him up a lot when he was passing, and even a lot of students began to pass rumors that she had always had a crush on Mr. Edward. But Priska didn't care. If she was being honest, yes, she did have a crush on him, and she didn't care whether the whole school gossiped about it or not. Nobody dared say it to her face anyway because she was the queen bee and everybody was intimidated by her. So it made her really angry to see Edward begin to admire Nene's intelligence and her beauty as well. It made Priska feel very jealous and angry. But aside from that, Priska had been the star student for so many years. And now, this quiet girl had come out from nowhere to challenge her throne. At first, Priska's irritation manifested in small ways. She would make snide comments here and there. She would roll her eyes when Nene answered a question. She would subtly mock her behind her back. Bissy, who had become Nene's closest friend, tried to stand up for her. She warned Nene to be careful around Priska, but Nene, the wonderful peacemaker, didn't want to cause trouble. She'll get over it, Nene would say, but Bissy wasn't so sure. As the weeks went by, Priska's disdain for Nene grew even more. It wasn't just about the competition in class, it was also about Mr. Edward. She couldn't stand seeing Mr. Edward smile impressively at Nene. It made her boil with anger inside. Priska constantly tried to draw Mr. Edward's attention to her. She would try to sit in front of his classes during his lessons, and she would linger after class just to ask him questions that she didn't need answers to, the way she sought his approval at every turn. But it didn't seem to be making much of a difference. Maybe at some point he used to give her attention, but it had slowly stopped. All that attention was now given to Nene. Priska was incredibly furious. How dared Nene come from nowhere and steal all the attention that had always been her? Priska began to bully Nene more openly. She would accidentally bump into her in the corridors. Of course, it was on purpose, but she would claim it was an accident. She would knock her book out of her hands or spread cruel rumors about her. Ada and Shade joined in, laughing at every insult and making Nene's life increasingly difficult. This made Nene very, very uncomfortable in school because she hated attention. She hated the embarrassment. She didn't like the way she was feeling. Though Bisi tried to intervene, there was only so much she could do, and Nene, wanting to avoid conflict, often brushed it off and never stood up for herself. She would allow the bullying to continue just so that she can keep peace, just because she didn't want to ever confront Priska. She didn't want to have an altercation with anybody. But Priska still wasn't getting what she wanted out of the situation. Yes, she was embarrassing Nene, but Edward was even getting closer and closer to her. His interest in her began to get even more serious. He would ask Nene to stay after class just to discuss her essays. He would compliment her writing and offer her extra reading materials. While Nene initially found his attention a bit flattering, she began to notice that some of his compliments were a bit inappropriate. He would comment on how beautiful she looked, how mature her body was, and how she seemed incredibly intelligent for her age. At first, Nene didn't think too much about it, but soon his words began to make her feel a little bit uncomfortable. Yet, at the same time, she did admit that she kinda liked it. She couldn't deny that she liked the attention. Mr. Edward was giving her a lot of attention and it was making her feel really good. Maybe because she never got to receive that kind of attention from home. Mr. Edward was handsome and charming as well. And for a girl who had never really experienced much affection in her life, his praises and compliments were really filling up a void in her heart. Bisi, her friend, also began to notice the unusual closeness between Mr. Edward and Nene. She confronted Nene as a friend and asked her about it. What is it with this sudden closeness, the secret meetings, the extra compliments from Mr. Edward? Nene told her not to worry about it, that he was just really impressed with her writing and he was giving her a lot of tips and reading materials to help her get even better. But Bisi still didn't like the sound of it. She asked Nene to be careful, and Nene didn't listen to her. Priska, seeing the growing rapport between Nene and Mr. Edward, was growing more livid. One of her friends, Ada, suggested that instead of continuing to bully Nene outrightly, something that had only earned Priska more scolding from Mr. Edward, and even earning Nene more pity from Edward himself, making the whole thing seem like it was backfiring on Priska. Ada advised Priska to take a different approach. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, Ada said. Priska, always cunning, decided to take her friend's advice. She began to befriend Nene, showering her with compliments and pretending to be interested in her life. At first, Nene was a bit wary, but slowly she began to let her guard down. Priska was popular and influential, and for a shy girl like Nene, being accepted by her seemed like some type of validation. So she went along with it. She began to hang out more with Priska and her friends, and she soon turned to one of the popular girls in school. Nene just assumed that Priska had repented and had decided to turn a new leaf and no longer be a bully. So she went along with the friendship. People soon started to refer to them as the clique because they soon began to move around everywhere together. They were always seen together and they were the newest big girls in school. Bessie, however, was not fooled by Priska's new act. She warned Nene repeatedly not to trust Priska, but Nene, somewhat desperate for acceptance and engrossed in the new feeling of being a popular girl, ignored her friend's advice. In fact, she slowly began to distance herself from Bessie, and subconsciously, she also began to look down on Bessie because Bessie wasn't popular and beautiful like the rest of them. As Priska grew closer to Nene, she began to subtly sabotage her. She would act as if she's helping her in her homework but give her wrong answers instead. Sometimes she would offer to proofread Nana's essays and make small changes that lowered her grades. Nene's grades actually began to deteriorate and get bad, but Nene somehow just didn't care. With this newfound popularity lifestyle, she didn't care anymore about her grades. At the same time, Nene's relationship with Edward was becoming even more complicated. Mr. Edward would find excuses to meet with her alone, often in his office after school hours. What began as innocent tutoring sessions began to turn into something more. Mr. Edward was increasingly making inappropriate comments about her appearance and even touching her arm, her shoulders, and her waist in ways that made her feel a little bit uneasy. But she didn't pay attention to that. She let it happen, she let it slide. Besides, she did have some type of attraction to him as well. Nene no longer spent time with BC. She barely even saw her. Most of her time was either spent with Priska and her clique or with Mr. Edward in his office. On one particular afternoon, everything was exposed and secrets were revealed. Priska, along with Ada and Shade, were walking back to the dormitory from their classroom when they began to hear certain voices that were muffled coming from an empty classroom. Curious, Priska tiptoed towards the classroom and immediately opened the door. There, she saw Mr. Edward kissing Nene. As soon as the door opened, Mr. Edward and Nene quickly separated themselves and looked at Priska with shock and fear written all over their faces. Priska was enraged. A mixture of anger, jealousy, and shock coursed through her veins, and she stared at them in rage. But soon after, she began to realize the power she had. She had just caught a school teacher kissing and making out with a student. She pondered on what to do, whether to use this to her advantage and blackmail Nene, maybe also expose the entire truth to the school so that everybody would know about it, or she could also decide to use this information to blackmail Mr. Edward himself. Edward and Nene stared in anticipation with shock and fear on their faces at Priska, wondering what her next line of action would be.